There is a particular kind of woman who does not need to raise her voice to make a room go quiet. She has only to lift her eyes and let them rest, coolly, deliberately, on whoever has said something foolish, and the silence does the rest. That was Lady Varnham, and for the better part of 4 decades, the whole of the English North had understood this without needing to be told twice. She was 71 years old that summer of 1892, and she had been a widow for 11 years, and in that time she had increased her late husband's already considerable fortune by nearly 1/3, through investments so shrewd that men twice her experience could not explain how she had done it. She held the futures of approximately 40 relations and dependents in her hands. She knew this, they knew this, and every summer, without fail, she gathered them all at Norbury Hall, her estate in the West Riding of Yorkshire, for 6 weeks of what everyone called a family visit, and what everyone knew was, in fact, a tribunal. In those 6 weeks, Lady Varnham watched. She received proposals for business ventures, and said very little in response. She attended the dinners and the lawn parties and the card evenings, and noted which cousin drank too much, and which nephew was short with the stable hands, and which smooth-mannered gentleman was paying attention to her great niece, Miss Colette Pryor, for reasons that had to do with the girl's inheritance rather than the girl herself. At the end of the 6 weeks, she made her decisions: who received her investment, who did not, whose marriage she would quietly sanction, and whose she would quietly prevent, who remained in her good graces, and who found, with a bewilderment they couldn't quite locate the source of, that doors had simply ceased to open. The whole anxious gathering strained every nerve, every summer, to manage her approval. They agreed with her opinions before she had quite finished stating them. They monitored her moods the way sailors monitor weather. They told her exactly what they believed she wished to hear, and not one of them, not a single soul in that careful, striving crowd, paid the smallest attention to the quiet woman who sat at Lady Varnham's elbow each morning and read her correspondence aloud. Why would they? She was Miss Tamsin Greer, Lady Varnham's reader, a plainly dressed woman of 28, with an unhurried voice, and the particular stillness that certain people carry like a second skin. Not timidity exactly, but something that made her nearly invisible in any room full of people busy being noticed. Her function was straightforward. Lady Varnham's eyesight had grown unreliable, and so Miss Greer read to her the morning papers, the letters of business, the legal documents, and occasionally, in the long evenings, a novel. She was very good at it. She never stumbled over the difficult words, and she never offered her opinions uninvited, and she faded, as a reader was meant to do, into the furniture of the room. The assembled relations at Norbury Hall walked past Miss Greer in hallways. They spoke across her as if she were a side table. The bolder ones dispatched her on small errands. Would she tell the kitchen that Mr. Colbert required his tea at 4? Would she fetch Sir Hector's forgotten gloves from the morning room? And she performed these errands without comment. She understood her station, or rather, she understood the station the world had assigned her, which is not quite the same thing, though no one there that summer was perceptive enough to notice the difference. And every single one of them, in their careful management of Lady Varnham's opinion, were making the same enormous mistake. But I am going to stop myself right there, my dears, right at the center of the mistake, before I have told you what it cost them, because you and I have an arrangement first. Before this story goes a step further, I want you to find the subscribe button for Moonlight at Marlowe and press it. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story finds you the moment I have it ready, and there is always a next. So find the button. I will be right here when you come back, and so will Miss Tamsin Greer, and I promise you, she is worth the wait. Now, come back to Norbury Hall with me. Here is what no one in that striving summer crowd knew. Every evening, when the last of the guests had gone to their rooms and the long house had fallen quiet, Lady Varnham did not ring for her maid. She rang for Miss Greer, and when Miss Greer came, she dismissed everyone else. The hovering butler, the lingering cousin, hoping for a private word, and she settled herself by the fire with her evening sherry and said the same words she had said every evening for 4 years. "Sit down, Miss Greer. You have been watching them again today. Tell me the truth of what you saw." This was the real arrangement, the one nobody in the entire house suspected. Lady Varnham did not rely on Miss Greer merely to read her letters. She relied on Miss Greer to read her people. Over 4 years, she had come to trust Miss Greer's judgment of human character absolutely, above her own, above her solicitors, above anyone whose counsel she had ever sought. In every significant decision she made about her money and her family and her favor, it was Miss Greer she consulted, and it was Miss Greer's quiet, unhurried assessment that settled the matter. The invisible reader who fetched gloves and faded into corners was, in truth and in careful secret, the mind behind every important judgment Lady Varnham made. The one the old woman trusted without reservation, the one she actually obeyed. Lady Varnham had kept this secret deliberately, for a reason that mattered to everything that followed. She had been fooled badly, twice in her life, by people who were charming to her face and disastrous in practice. Power, she had learned, made you nearly helpless before a well-worn mask, because everyone who needed something from you put on their best one, but no one bothered to wear a mask for a nobody. They were careless in front of the unimportant. They were their truest, most unguarded selves before the one person whose report of them would eventually decide their fates. So Lady Varnham had made herself a pair of eyes that the world didn't bother to hide from, and through those eyes she saw everything. She had discovered Miss Greer's gift by accident, 3 months after hiring her, when she asked what the girl made of a solicitor whose proposal seemed sound, but who made Lady Varnham uneasy in a way she couldn't name. Miss Greer had given her opinion without softening it, and without first determining whether it was what Lady Varnham wished to hear. The man was dishonest. She had watched him, over 2 days, be consistently contemptuous of everyone in the household he believed could not affect his prospects. That contempt, she said in the plainest possible terms, was always the most reliable measure of a person's character. Lady Varnham had investigated through other means. Miss Greer had been entirely correct. After that, the arrangement took hold slowly, and then completely, and Lady Varnham made very certain the world continued to see Miss Greer as she always had, as furniture that occasionally spoke when spoken to. But first, my dears, you must understand why Tamsin Greer saw the world the way she did, because the still self-contained woman I have described was not born that way. She was made that way, and the making of her was a wound, and the wound is why the story ends as it does. She had been a rector's daughter, well-raised and warmly educated, in a modest household in Shropshire. At 23, she had been engaged to a young man named Mr. Alliston, who was reading for the law, and who spoke very earnestly about his admiration for her mind and her person together, and who, by every measure she had at the time, seemed to mean it. She had been happy in the clean, forward-looking way of a young woman who believes she can see the shape of her life, and finds it good. Then her father's health failed, and with it the household finances, in that way that decent and unworldly men sometimes allow to happen, slowly, and then catastrophically, with no warning proportionate to the scale of the disaster. And Tamsin discovered, at 24, the lesson the world teaches women with great efficiency when it needs to, that a woman without money is a woman without options, and that the young men who speak earnestly about admiring your mind locate that mind considerably less interesting once your father's affairs are ruined. Mr. Alliston had been regretful. He had not been cruel, she would grant him that. He had simply been honest in the way that people who have already made a decision are always honest about it afterward. He had said he was sorry, and that he had hoped for otherwise, and he had married a solicitor's daughter from Bristol inside the year. That was the wound. She had learned what it taught, that she had value to the world only so long as she had something the world wanted. And so she had done the thing that women in her situation do when they are both proud and practical. She had found work, she had made herself useful, she had learned to need very little and expect nothing, and she had built a small, ordered, dignified life inside those reduced expectations, and she had told herself, with increasing conviction over 4 years, that she was content. She was not content, she was managing. There is a difference. Managing is what you do when you have decided that certain doors are permanently closed and that it is foolish to stand before them wanting. She managed beautifully, and it was cold. That was the precise state of things when Mr. Caspar Norwood arrived at Norbury Hall. He came late on a Thursday afternoon, arriving in a hired conveyance rather than a private carriage, wearing a good coat that had been turned once, carrying his own bag up the steps because he hadn't tipped the driver enough to encourage assistance. He had the general air of him who knew exactly where he stood in the social order of the occasion and had made his peace with it long before the carriage left the road. He was a civil engineer. He worked for wages, honestly and competently, on road surveys and bridge assessments and the unglamorous infrastructure of the counties. He was 33 and had a quiet face and the kind of steadiness some men carry that has nothing to do with wealth and everything to do with having been tested and found equal to the test. He had no fortune and no expectations and no scheme. Lady Varnham was his mother's cousin, and duty had required this visit, and he fully intended to endure the fortnight pleasantly and return to his work. He noticed Miss Greer on his first evening. It would be too much to say that no one else could have noticed her, but in the specific sense that matters, the sense of registering a human being as a human being and finding that registration worth holding, he was the only one who did. He watched Sir Hector Stane send her to retrieve a forgotten glass in a tone one might use for a dog. He watched 2 female cousins discuss her appearance, loudly and carelessly, within 3 feet of her. He watched her bear all of it with a stillness that he would have described, if pressed, as extraordinary, not because it was defeated, but because it wasn't. There was something behind that stillness that was entirely intact. It was simply very far away from the people trying to reach it. The next morning he brought her a chair. It was a small thing. She had been standing in the morning room, waiting for Lady Varnham to finish a conversation, and every seat was occupied, and no one had thought to remedy this. Mr. Norwood thought to remedy it. He rose from his own chair, brought it to where she was standing, and said, in an ordinary tone, that she ought to have a seat while she waited, and he said it the way one says it to a person. Tamsin Greer had not been spoken to as simply and unguardedly as that, with no agenda and no performance, in a very long time. She managed, she believed, to receive the courtesy without revealing what it did to her. She thanked him. He nodded and went to find himself another chair. But he came back. The next day, and the day after that, not intrusively, not with the air of a man who had appointed himself her champion. He simply talked with her when they were in proximity, and listened to her answers with a focused, genuine attention she could not locate a motive for. He asked what she made of the bridge survey she had read from the newspaper that morning. He asked about a novel he had seen on the side table. He asked once, with a slight smile, whether she found the social arithmetic of the gathering as exhausting to observe as he found it to participate in. She had said, surprising herself, that she found it clarifying rather than exhausting, and he had looked at her with real interest and said, "Tell me what you mean by that." She told him the shape of it, not the true extent of what she saw and what she did with it, which was Lady Varnham's secret, and not hers to share, but enough. That people revealed themselves most thoroughly in the moments they believed were unobserved. That the most useful information about a character was rarely in what a person said to the important people in the room, and almost always in what they said to the unimportant ones. Mr. Norwood sat with that for a moment and said quietly that he believed she was entirely right and that he wished more people understood it. That was the moment she began to lose her footing. She tried to tell herself he was simply a decent man who treated everyone this way, which was partly true. He was kind to the scullery maid, and courteous to the groundskeeper, and had no visible interest in the social jockeying that consumed everyone else. But he sought out her company specifically. He saved things to tell her. He found her in the quieter rooms, and they talked, sometimes for half an hour at a stretch, about books and work, and the strange leveling experience of being poor in a room full of people pretending they were not worried about money. They had arrived at similar territories of the soul by different routes. She through abandonment, he through a modest birth that had never given him illusions, and they recognized in each other the particular dignity of a person who has made peace with reduced circumstances without ever reducing their expectations of what a human being ought to be. There was an evening in the garden, late in August, when most of the guests had drifted inside, and she had remained because the roses, she told herself, were at their best at dusk. She was not in the habit of lying to herself, and she knew she had stayed because she was not ready for the day to end. Mr. Norwood had remained also, with the same unspoken honesty, and they stood for a while in silence that required no filling, and then he said, in the careful way he said the things that cost him something, that he found he was dreading the end of the fortnight for a reason he had not expected when he arrived. She did not answer immediately. She let it sit in the rose-scented dusk, because she was afraid of what her answer would be, and what it would mean to give it. What she did not know, could not know, from inside her own carefully managed equilibrium, was what was happening in the bright rooms she passed through each day, what it was costing Sir Hector Stane. Sir Hector was accomplished in all the ways that counted at Norbury Hall. He had an address in Mayfair, a manner so smooth it left no fingerprints, and a smile he deployed with the precision of a fine instrument. He flattered Lady Varnham exquisitely. He pursued Miss Colette Pryor with a practiced ardour that had the girl half dizzy, and the other female relations sighing in vicarious pleasure at the romance of it. To everyone whose good opinion he required, he was polished courtesy itself. To everyone he did not require, beginning with the servants and extending, with considerable interest, to Miss Greer. He was something else entirely. He spoke to her as one speaks to furniture that has failed to be useful. He was not merely dismissive. He was the kind of man who could make a dismissal feel like a small, precise violence. Twice, in Miss Greer's vicinity, seized things he intended her to hear, about women of her station and their habits of forgetting it. Once, when she was slow to move from a doorway because she was carrying an armful of papers, he said something that made the footman behind him look at the ceiling. Miss Greer heard all of it. She always did. She bore it with her particular stillness, and each evening by the fire she told Lady Varnham exactly what she had seen, in the flat, precise language she always used, without emphasis or rancour, which somehow made it worse. Lady Varnham listened. She said very little. She went to bed on those evenings with her expression arranged into its usual impenetrability, and she thought about what she had been told. She was also thinking, those evenings, about something else Miss Greer had mentioned, not about Sir Hector, about Mr. Norwood. Miss Greer had been precise and flat about him too, because she was always precise and flat. But Lady Varnham was 71 years old, and had been reading human beings very nearly as long as Miss Greer had, and she could see, beneath the careful language, what Miss Greer herself was perhaps not yet willing to look at squarely. The old woman sat by her fire and thought, as she had not permitted herself to think in 4 years, about what Tamsin Greer actually deserved, and then she began, quietly, to make a plan. The last great dinner of the summer gathering came on a Saturday evening in late August, when the gardens were at their fullest, and the house warm with candlelight and the whole assembly dressed in its best. Lady Varnham took her seat at the head of the table. She allowed the dinner to proceed through its courses. She was gracious and composed and gave nothing away. Sir Hector was at his most brilliant. He had by this point proposed to Miss Colette and been received with every appearance of favourable feeling, and he expected the evening to confirm his triumph. Then Lady Varnham set down her glass. She did not raise her voice. She never did. "I want to say something," she said, "before we have our pudding, because I am old enough to prefer saying things directly and in good time." The table stilled. "I have had you all here for 6 weeks," she continued, "and I have watched every one of you carefully, as I do each summer. What you do not know is the method by which I watch." She looked then at Miss Greer, seated at the far end of the table in the least prominent chair, beside no one of particular distinction. "Miss Greer has been with me for 4 years, Lady Varnham said. "In that time she has read me my correspondence and my newspapers and my contracts. That is what you have seen her do. What you have not seen is what happens each evening when the house goes quiet, and I send everyone else away and ask her to tell me the truth of what she observed during the day." A particular quality of silence settled over the table. The kind that comes when a room full of people begins, simultaneously, to understand something they cannot quite believe. "Miss Greer has the finest judgment of human character I have ever encountered," Lady Varnham said, "and I have, for 4 years, made every significant decision, financial, familial, and otherwise, based upon her counsel. When you believed you were working to win my good opinion, you were in fact working to win hers. She has been watching you in the moments you thought you were unobserved. And what she found there has decided your standing in this house more thoroughly than anything you said or did in my presence." The silence had changed texture. It was the silence of people calculating, very rapidly, every careless thing they had said and done in front of Miss Tamsin Greer. "I will tell you what she has told me," Lady Varnham continued. "Sir Hector," her eyes moved to him, "you will not be marrying my great niece. You have been charming to me and charming to Colette, and you are charming to everyone whose cooperation you need. But Miss Greer has watched you for 6 weeks, treat the people beneath your notice with contempt, and she has found consistently that there is no quality of soul underneath the charm. A man who believes that courtesy is owed only to the useful will eventually make everyone around him useless to him. I will not send my great niece into that. You are welcome to finish your pudding, Sir Hector, and I wish you well in your other endeavours." Sir Hector Staines's face was a remarkable thing to observe. He had spent 6 weeks constructing a careful mask, and the mask had been reviewed by someone he had never once troubled to deceive. Lady Varnham continued. There were others. A cousin who had sought an investment, and who had been consistently unkind to the household staff. A nephew whose business proposal sounded solid until you listened to how he spoke about his partners when he believed the room was empty. Each was named, one at a time. The room had gone from still to stricken. Then Lady Varnham said, "There is one more thing." She looked again toward Miss Greer, and her voice was different. Something warmer beneath the precision. "Mr. Norwood," she said. He looked up from the far side of the table, where he had sat quietly through the whole extraordinary proceeding, not with the stricken look of the others, but with the focused attention of a man absorbing something significant. "You have been kind to Miss Greer since the first day of your arrival," Lady Varnham said. "Not strategically, not with any calculation of advantage, because you had no reason to believe any advantage was possible. You were kind to her because you could not help it, and because you saw a person being treated as furniture, and your nature would not allow you to ignore it. Miss Greer has told me this. It was, I will add, the first time in 4 years she has spoken of any person in this house in terms that suggested she expected nothing disappointing from them." The whole table was looking at him now, all of them, with the dawning understanding of people who had just learned that the man they had dismissed as an insignificant poor relation had been, the entire time, the only one in favour with the only judge who mattered. Caspar Norwood, for his part, was looking at Miss Greer. She was watching him from her end of the table, with the stillness she always carried, and beneath it he could see something she would not have allowed herself to show if she had known her face was showing it. Something waiting. Something that had been waiting for a very long time, and was now deciding whether it was finally safe. He understood, sitting there with the room's eyes on him. Everything that had just been revealed. The woman he had spent 6 weeks finding reasons to talk to. The woman whose thoughts he had been saving up, whose company had made the long evenings at Norbury Hall feel different than he had ever expected, was not the powerless nobody she had appeared. She was the one Lady Varnham trusted. She was the true arbiter of every fate in this room. He waited to feel different about her. He examined himself for the calculation that should have been possible now. The instinct to reassess, to want things in a new way, to see her worth in light of what she was worth to others. It did not come. He excused himself from the table, quietly, without hurry, and walked the length of the room to where she sat. He said, low enough that it was not a performance for the watching table, but not so low as to be a secret from it. I had thought I was going home Monday as empty-handed as I arrived, which I was entirely prepared for, but I find I'm not prepared to go home without asking you something first, before I understand the full weight of the asking. Miss Greer, would you give me the chance to know you better? In circumstances where you are not attending to someone else's correspondence, and I am not inventing reasons to linger in whatever room you happen to be in. Something moved across Tamsin Greer's face, not surprise. Something further along than surprise. Something that had been folded away for a long time, and was now reconsidering whether it was allowed to unfold. You understand what was just said in this room, she told him. About what I am. I understand it perfectly, he said. I am asking on account of what you are everywhere else, which is the same woman who told me, in a garden 3 evenings ago, that she found a room full of people clarifying rather than exhausting. I have thought about that every day since. I would prefer to think about it with you present. She looked at him for a moment. He let her. You would have gone home Monday, she said carefully, and not asked if none of this had been said tonight. I would have gone home Monday, he said, and regretted it for a considerable time. I am slow at asking for what I am not certain I deserve. But you have made it easy just now by already knowing precisely what I am, which is a man of no particular consequence and modest means, who spent a fortnight finding a reason to be in whatever room you were reading in, and who had not worked out what to do about that. He paused. I have worked it out now. What Tamsin Greer did not say aloud, because some things are one's own, was that she had spent 4 years becoming very skilled at wanting nothing, and that the most frightening thing about the past 6 weeks was how thoroughly and irreversibly he had undone that. She had been so careful, and then he had carried her a chair, and asked what she meant, and listened, and she had not been able to stop herself from having hope again, which she had specifically decided she was no longer permitted. She said, I think Monday may be too soon to go home after all. And Lady Varnham, at the head of the table, set down her pudding spoon with a small and private satisfaction and said nothing whatsoever. They were engaged before autumn came and married the following spring, and the small, precise, dignified of life that Tamsin Greer had built out of reduced expectations became, in the end, something considerably wider than she had allowed herself to plan for. She remained close to Lady Varnham until the old woman's death 7 years later. And she remained, to the very end, the one the old woman trusted most in the world. And the assembled relations and guests of that summer, the ones who had spoken across Miss Greer in doorways, who had sent her on errands, who had said careless and unkind things in her presence. Because it cost them nothing, scattered back to their various lives with the same lesson packed in their luggage, the lesson that no one ever wants to learn until they have been made to. And that costs something different every time. The truest account of your character has never been written in the words you choose carefully for the people you need. It has been written, without your knowing it, in the words you choose carelessly for the people you believe cannot matter. The still woman in the corner, the one you look past, the one you speak over, the one you dispatch on small errands because she is there and convenient, she is seeing you. Not the version you have prepared, the real one. And the real one, my dears, is the one that lasts. Be kind to the quiet ones. Not because the reader at the elbow might turn out to be the one the great lady obeys, though she very well might be. Be kind because it is the only version of yourself that holds together when the lights come on. I will be back at Moonlight at Marlowe with another story, and another, and there is no end to them, and everyone has a heart worth sitting with. Subscribe if you have not. Come back when you have. The fire here is always warm. And there is always a chair for you, and I would be sorry to tell these stories without you on the other side of the flame.